Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is no doubt one of the most exciting games of 2021. Not only is it the next full-length entry into one of gaming's most beloved action platforming franchises, it's the first game to showcase what a truly next-generation title can look like. But aside from ray tracing and near-instant load times, what else makes Rift Apart so exciting? Is it the crazy new weapons, the ridiculous, and I do mean ridiculous, set pieces? What about the new traversal mechanics and the beautiful new levels? Well, if you're curious about anything related to Insomniac's next big game, then I hope you'll join me as I look at everything we know about Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Before we begin, here's a fun fact. As of now, only around 6% of my viewers are subscribed. That blows my mind. The next time I publish a preview for, say, Far Cry 6 or any other big game, 94% of my viewers won't get notified. I don't post videos very often, but when I do, I make sure they're worth your time. So if you like highly researched, highly edited previews just like this one, hit that subscribe button below. And with that out of the way, let's take a look at Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Before we get into gameplay, let's set the stage. First off, Rift Apart takes place a few years after the events of Into the Nexus, not the more recent 2016 remake. That said, if all you've played is the 2016 game or you're new to the series, no worries. The developers at Insomniac have made it clear that Rift Apart is a standalone, full-length experience that's great for both first-time players and longtime fans of the series. The story begins during a celebration parade where Ratchet and Clank are the guests of honor. Of course, things couldn't possibly go according to plan, and it's not long before a familiar villain, Dr. Nefarious, shows up and steals the Dimensionator. The Dimensionator, if you didn't know, is a device capable of opening portals to other dimensions, and Clank was hoping to offer it as a gift to Ratchet so he could visit an alternate dimension populated by Lombaxes just like him. After Nefarious swipes the Dimensionator, he reveals his plan to travel to an alternate dimension where he always wins. Not only that, but his careless treatment of the Dimensionator has caused the fabric of space-time to become unstable, forcing dimensional rifts to tear open and threaten what Insomniac calls the Omniverse. We see these rifts open and close during this interdimensional chase sequence where the two heroes instantly jump from planet to planet. Then it happens. Clank is thrust from Ratchet's back straight through one of these purple rifts, and the two become separated not just across space, but across dimensions. As such, Ratchet's goal, at least in the early game, is to find and reunite with Clank. But where did Clank end up? Well, it appears he landed in Nefarious City, which, as the name suggests, is set within the same dimension that Dr. Nefarious discovered, the one where he always wins. Now, this is where Clank meets up with Rivet, and fear not, I talk about her a bunch in just a few minutes. And if you're curious about Nefarious City, I have a whole section towards the end of this video where I talk about the game's levels. But for now, I want to focus on something Ratchet says right after he arrives in Nefarious City and starts looking for Clank.
Emperor? Does that mean there are two Nefariouses now?
Yep, it seems that in this dimension there's an alternate version of Dr. Nefarious known as Emperor Nefarious. But this raises one major question. If Emperor Nefarious and Dr. Nefarious are indeed alternate versions of one another, how will the Nefarious from Ratchet's world adjust to a dimension dominated by an even more powerful version of himself? Surely Emperor Nefarious won't just let a lowly doctor barge in and steal his thunder, right? Or will they team up and become even more powerful? We'll have to see how the story plays out if they are indeed multiple versions of the same villain. Also, I want to highlight that in this scene, which takes place after Ratchet and Clank become separated, the nefarious trooper piloting this giant robot centipede is trying to capture Clank. I'm not sure what this means, though it does seem significant. But enough about the evildoers. What about the heroes? Well, we know about Ratchet, and we know about Clank, but as you know, and as I mentioned a moment ago, Rift Apart introduces an entirely new playable character. As you may know, Ratchet is the last remaining Lombax, at least in his dimension. So when it was revealed that a new Lombax was going to star in Rift Apart, it was a big deal. But who is she? Well, her name is Rivet, and yes, it was confirmed by Insomniac that she is in fact the alternate dimension version of Ratchet. As put by Rift Apart game director Mike Daly, quote, "Ratchet gets pulled into another dimension and discovers his dimensional counterpart," end quote. So what else do we know? Well, Rivet is a freedom fighter battling against the tyranny of Emperor Nefarious. We also know she's a loner and a bit awkward. As stated in a preview on thegamer.com, Rivet is basically Ratchet if Ratchet never met Clank. Not surprisingly, her interactions with Clank will play into her character development and story arc. As put by Daly, Rivet is, quote, "the one that you'll follow along her sort of like growth path as she learns to be a teammate," end quote. And Rivet is clearly used to getting by on her own. You may have noticed her mechanical arm. This is something she actually built herself after suffering an injury in her fight against Nefarious. So yeah, Rivet is a badass. But what will it be like to step into her shoes? Well, it doesn't appear she'll deviate too far from Ratchet. Insomniac has confirmed that the two will have the same core moveset, and Daly himself confirmed that the two heroes will level up together rather than on separate tracks. Quote, "Not only do they have the same progression paths, we found that when you bounce back between the two heroes, a lot of the moment-to-moment rewards for playing well weren't quite as enticing if you knew that it was only going to be useful for like half the game. So we connected their progression paths so that if you level up this one hero, you level up the other hero. If you purchased a weapon as one, you don't need to keep track of which hero has which parts. They all sort of stay connected and stay in sync," end quote. And not to belabor the point, but IGN's most recent preview also confirmed the two heroes will have identical progression paths for leveling up their health as well. There is, however, one big reason that playing as Rivet might be different than playing as Ratchet, at least in the parts of the game we've seen. And that's the fact that Rivet will have Clank strapped to her back, while Ratchet will not. That means that, unlike past games, Ratchet won't have access to Clank's trusty helipack. Of course, this brings up some huge questions about Rift Apart. Will you spend more time as Ratchet or Rivet? And will you ever get to switch between the two heroes at will? First off, while it's not a lot to go on, in an interview with Game Informer, Daly did make it sound like at least the story will provide equal weight for both heroes. Quote, "The overarching story of the game sort of has Ratchet and Rivet working in parallel to help solve the dimensional cataclysm." Okay, but how will you determine which Lombax you play as? Well, it sounds like this is actually determined by the story, not the player. Daly explained this when he mentioned revisiting planets you've already completed. Quote, "When you do, basically you will play as the Lombax that played through that planet when they first arrived there for story reasons. So basically the two Lombaxes tag team the planets. You can sort of travel freely around the galaxy at most points in the game, and so that's how both you choose your planet and you choose which Lombax you're playing as." Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and not to worry. I'll talk more about traveling between planets later on, but what I took away from that quote is that each planet has a mission and a story beat for either Rivet or Ratchet, and that determines which Lombax you'll play as on that planet. If this is true, it would mean pretty definitively that you won't be able to switch between Lombaxes at will, and that each level is only playable as one Lombax or the other. But in that Ratchet and Rivet have identical movesets and share progression, which one you play as should have zero impact on the gameplay. But whichever Lombax you're controlling, whether it's Ratchet or Rivet, one thing is clear. Rift Apart is going to feature the most fluid gameplay we've ever seen in a Ratchet and Clank game. Let's take a look. Some of the most exciting aspects of Insomniac's most recent State of Play gameplay reveal were the brand new traversal mechanics. First is the ability to wall run. Ratchet and Rivet will be able to traverse these vertical square platforms. This will no doubt add more flexibility to how you get around certain environments, and it's just going to be fun to see what sort of creative level designs this new mechanic allows for. Next is the Phantom Dash. Not only will this allow Ratchet and Rivet to dodge incoming projectiles and attacks, it will apparently provide a brief period of invincibility. So yeah, during that brief animation period, you're invulnerable. The dash can also be used in midair, meaning you'll be able to add a little extra distance to your jumps. Adding even more mobility and, more importantly, more range in the air is the grappling maneuver. And while that's not new to the series, what is new, or at least I think it's new, is a gadget called the Hurl Shot, which I'm pretty sure is what allows Ratchet and Rivet to do this. And let's not forget the hover boots. While we've seen these before, they should help soften landings, add even more distance to your jumps, and they'll even let you zoom around at high speeds. When all these new and old movement mechanics are combined, they should allow you to traverse environments much faster and more seamlessly than ever before. But more importantly, they should make for a more rewarding experience, or at least that's the hope for Insomniac. According to Daily, quote, "If you broaden the moveset of the hero just a little bit wider than what they actually need to do any given thing, then there's this avenue for player expression and a higher skill ceiling, as you can sort of make how you cross this gap or how you navigate this threat, how you close this distance, really your own thing. And that makes executing it that much more satisfying." End quote. That said, if you do get tired of hoofing it, there will be segments where you'll get around in the air. I believe we've seen 2 segments where you'll strap onto the back of one of these dragon-like creatures, but that's not all. Game Informer's preview stated that, quote, 2 mountable beasts are in the game. And while I alluded to this earlier, it's also been hard confirmed by Daily that yes, you'll once again pilot your trusty spaceship as you hop from planet to planet. Quote, "In sort of like true Ratchet fashion, a lot of times you'll sort of like hop in your ship and you'll have the choice of which planet to tackle next." End quote. In one of the more recent Rift Apart trailers, we did see this brief clip where it appears Ratchet is choosing which planet to visit from the cockpit of his spaceship, but I'd still hope to see some sort of overworld that allows you to fly around and explore the galaxy as either Ratchet or Rivet. So that covers the core movement mechanics and then some. But when it comes to getting around individual levels, the galaxy, or the entire Omniverse, there's one mechanic I haven't covered. And it's the one the entire game is named after: the rifts. As you know, rifts come in 2 colors, orange and purple, and they're both very different from one another. Let's start with the orange rifts. Spot one and you can latch onto it with your rift tether to instantly travel from your current location to the location of that rift. One cool visual detail here is the animation makes it look like that part of the level comes to you, but make no mistake, your rift tether is more or less a hookshot that pulls you across the map. Orange portals will come in handy for exploration, as you'll be able to use them to zip over to areas that would otherwise be out of reach, and they'll be useful for flanking enemies in combat or flat out escaping a crowded battlefield. And you know those cool rail grinding segments? Yeah, those are back, and in certain points you'll be able to use your rift tether to zip from rail to rail. Okay, so what about the purple portals? As you know, these will instantly teleport you to entirely different levels. While this might not seem like a big deal at first, it wouldn't even be possible on the PlayStation 4. Thanks to its lightning-fast SSD, the PS5 is able to load these levels without pausing the gameplay. Actually, it's during this brief animation, where you're tumbling through interdimensional space, that your PS5 is loading the new level. And not only will you be traveling from planet to planet, you'll also be traveling, at least at specific story moments, from dimension to dimension. And this raises one big question. How will Ratchet's dimension differ from Rivet's? And will you ever be able to switch between dimensions at, say, the press of a button? Well, let's take a look. First off, we know you'll visit some planets that were featured in previous Ratchet and Clank games. And as put by the PlayStation blog, these planets will feature, quote, new dimensional twists. For example, expect to meet alternate versions of familiar characters. Take Skid McMarx, the decidedly laid-back professional hoverboarder we saw in the 2016 Ratchet and Clank remake. In Rivet's dimension, he's no longer a hoverboarder, but instead an elite resistance hacker known as the Phantom. Based on the State of Play demo, we know you'll meet the Phantom at Club Nefarious in Nefarious City, and it's the Phantom who gives Ratchet his new wall-running ability. Even Rivet herself, being an alternate version of Ratchet, is a great example of just how differently characters can present themselves in this new dimension. It will no doubt be a lot of fun for longtime fans to see how characters and environments differ from previous games. Okay, but what if you want to travel from dimension to dimension, or even just from planet to planet? Well, we've only seen Ratchet and Clank pass from planet to planet during cutscenes or during scripted gameplay moments. In other words, the rifts seem out of their control. My guess is that if you decide you want to visit or revisit a certain planet, this will be reserved for the segments Daily referred to earlier, where you select which planet to visit via your spaceship. But what about traveling from dimension to dimension? Yes, there are specific levels that allow you to do this. They're called sync planets, and while we haven't seen them, they were described in Game Informer's recent preview. Quote, Ratchet and Rivet will eventually travel to places Insomniac calls sync planets, which show off two versions of the same place for their respective realities. To switch to them, the player just has to hit a lever. In that time, the screen flashes white and the other version of the planet appears, looking dramatically different yet with some clear similarities. The article then goes on to make the great point that this opens up a lot of possibilities for some really fun puzzles. One final thing to mention about the rifts in Rift Apart is that some purple rifts will transport you to what are called pocket dimensions. These aren't separate levels, but more like side missions, offshoots of whatever level you're on that take place in a sort of interdimensional pocket of space-time. But what you find in these pocket dimensions might defy your expectations. According to previews from both Kinda Funny and GameSpot, environments inside pocket dimensions don't always obey the laws of physics. Kinda Funny even went on to say that some of your gadgets will work differently in pocket dimensions. What exactly that means, we'll have to wait and see. Now, you'll be required to visit some pocket dimensions as part of the story. Here, Rivet wanders into a pocket dimension to find a Speedle, a speedy beetle, so she can ride it across the acid swamps back on the main level of planet Sargasso. But we know based on this clip that many pocket dimensions will be optional. So what can we expect to find in these optional pockets? Well, you know those fancy pieces of armor we've seen in some of the game's marketing? Speaking again to Game Informer, Daily said those are at least one of the things you'll find. Quote, a lot of pieces of armor are hidden in pocket dimensions, which you've seen. So you'll go a little bit off the beaten path, crack those open, find a concentrated traversal challenge. If you can get through it, you'll find a new armor piece. End quote. Now, we know that not all armor is found in pocket dimensions, and it's likely that pocket dimensions will feature a lot of other stuff to experience and explore, but I'm totally down to hunt for collectibles and complete traversal challenges that feature wacky laws of physics. Before I move on, you know how Rivet took that Speedle through the rift across a new area of Sargasso? Well, in this scene, we see Ratchet take a dragon through a rift as well. It appears that reaching previously inaccessible areas might often involve locating creatures, sometimes in pocket dimensions or maybe on other planets, then bringing them back to the area you'd like to explore. Okay, now that we've covered how you'll get around the worlds in Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, well, which worlds will they be? And what can you expect once you get there? As I've already mentioned, Rift Apart will feature locations that are new to the series, as well as some old favorites that feature the dimensional twists I talked about earlier. Let's first look at the new locations Insomniac has shown in detail. I'm going to start with Megalopolis, the city we saw in the first gameplay demo shown all the way back in August of 2020, and in some more recent gameplay footage. Now, I know some of you were saying Ratchet and Clank have already visited a similar city called Megapolis on planet Endako. And let me just say now, forgive me if my pronunciation is a little off. But based on these subtitles, we know this city that we're seeing here is called Megalopolis, while the city that Ratchet and Clank have visited previously is called Megapolis. Megalopolis, Megapolis. It's a subtle change, but the names are different. I've seen some previews claiming that the two are one and the same, but then why the name change? One possibility is that the two are alternate dimension versions of each other, but I doubt this because if I have the timeline correct, this sequence takes place in Ratchet's dimension before the two are flung into Rivet's alternate universe. Another possibility is that this is a different city on the same urban planet of Indako. In any case, one thing's for sure, whether this is a new city or a city we've been to before, it has a familiar aesthetic. But that can't be said for Nefarious City, the cyberpunk-themed level we saw in the recent State of Play showcase. Funny enough, I've seen two previews, including the preview published by GameSpot, that say Nefarious City is the alternate version of Megalopolis. That might be the case, but that would indicate, at least to me, that Megalopolis is set on planet Corson 5 because we now know for sure that's where Nefarious City is set. Now, I'm not the foremost expert here, but I've done some digging and for the life of me, I can't find any evidence that Corson 5 is a planet from any past Ratchet and Clank games. But please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. As for what you'll discover in Nefarious City, it's obviously been taken over by Emperor Nefarious, so don't expect a warm welcome. That said, you will meet several members of the Resistance as you wander the streets of this beautiful city. Okay, let's now look at 3 planets in Rift Apart that we've definitely visited in past games. First is Sargasso, the swampy, almost prehistoric themed planet we initially saw in Tools of Destruction. We know this is where Rivet has set up her Resistance hideout, which is likely what we see here. Another cool thing about Sargasso, or at least the part of it that we get to explore, is that it's home to a gelatonium plant, which Rivet and Clank visit here. And this might have some pretty major gameplay implications. Gelatonium, if you didn't know, is the bouncy substance that Ratchet used to create bouncy platforms in Tools of Destruction. It would seem like a huge tease if we got to visit a gelatonium plant, but without the fun traversal challenges that springy gelatonium platforms could bring to the gameplay. Lastly, as I've mentioned, Sargasso will feature acid swamps that apparently require a speedle if you want to cross. Another familiar planet we've seen is Tauren 4, a rocky desert world which we explored in A Crack in Time. In Rift Apart, it looks like the star of the show on Tauren 4 is going to be this literal roller coaster of a set piece, but more on that later. The next planet we know for sure to be in the game is Ardolis, the tropical ocean planet where Ratchet and Clank get separated. It's here where they're fighting a group of space pirates as well as this kraken creature. We don't know if Ardolis is a planet you'll spend much time on, but if not, it would seem odd for Insomniac to include it during such a pivotal story moment. But one level that could be set on Ardolis, again a largely aquatic planet, is a level we haven't actually seen. In an interview with TheGamer.com, Daly did say that one of the areas that they've built is, quote, an abandoned underwater base where we try to make it a little bit spooky and play with some suspense tropes. I don't know about you, but I'm totally down for a spooky subaquatic base. Next, I want to look at this clip here. Notice the mention of sand sharks. Apparently, sand sharks are native to another desert planet, Iridia. Now, if sand sharks can teleport to us, I see no reason why we might not at some point teleport to them. Of course, this is just speculation on my part. Finally, we saw in a recent trailer that the game will also feature several other planets. Savali, which we see here, and Blizar Prime, where we'll apparently explore some mines, so I'd expect an underground level here. We also got a glimpse of the Skartsu debris field, where we'll visit a location called Zerkis. That sounds to me like some sort of vendor or business that belongs to whoever Zerky is. Again, there are people who know plenty more about Ratchet and Clank than me, so if any of these new planets are familiar to you, sound off in the comments. Okay, those are all the worlds we've seen, but before moving on, I want to talk a bit about some of the content you'll experience as you explore the areas within. In particular, I want to highlight another of Daly's quotes from his Game Informer interview. Quote, like past Ratchet games, there's a lot of sort of meaty and interesting optional stuff on each planet. Little side paths to explore or like subplots within the level's stories. So you can go back to previously visited planets and take care of all that extra content. End quote. Now, this is nothing new to Ratchet and Clank, but we did get a glimpse of many optional activities at the end of the last State of Play showcase. First and most interesting to me are dimensional Clank puzzles. Here it seems Clank has to get a certain number of Clank holographs to pass through a gate in order to solve the puzzle. That's pretty much how Daly explained them, but he added a few more details. Quote, once you're inside, getting the dimensional energy flowing looks to him like getting a line of clanks from one end to the other. It's how he sort of visualizes this abstract concept. So if you've played Lemmings, it might look a little bit familiar. Daly also said that the laws of physics will change within these puzzles. Quote, Clank sort of explores these arenas, finding spheres of influence like these orbs that he can plug into the environment to change the physics properties of these Clank lemmings, or to change the physics properties of the environment itself, or Clank, end quote. That's a lot to interpret, but the way it sounds, these are one of the gameplay elements of Rift Apart that I'm the most excited to explore. Next are glitch challenges. Insomniac didn't explain these other than to show this brief gameplay clip, but we do know that you'll control this spider bot which can ascend walls and even stick to the ceiling. Looking at this screenshot, we can see that your goal is apparently to take out a certain number of virus nests, whatever those are. Also, the spider bot appears to have two types of ammo, each mapped to a different trigger. Next are arena challenges, which are back from previous games, though we haven't seen much. Finally, completionists will be happy to know that golden bolts are back. Exploring every corner of every planet to find all the golden bolts should provide a decent amount of replay value. And as I mentioned earlier, armor will also be an optional collectible. Based on this screenshot, we can see that each armor set is made of 3 pieces, and we know that you can customize the color of each armor set. And then there's the stat boost menu on the right. It appears that wearing a full set of armor will net you the best stats, and it looks like the stats are the same for every set of armor. If that's the case, you won't have to pick between your favorite looking set and the set that boosts your favorite stats. As I've mentioned earlier, some of these pieces of armor will be found in pocket dimensions, but that's not all. As put again by, you guessed it, Daly, quote, you can get some of them from, for example, completing arena challenges. So most armor in the game is just an optional thing that's a reward for doing more than the main story asks you to do. Ultimately, it sounds like the levels in Rift Apart might have more optional content than any levels in previous Ratchet and Clank games. But of course, you won't be able to just explore these levels without facing some resistance. I probably don't need to remind you that Rift Apart will have a lot of bad guys. There will be space pirates, blarg, sand sharks, nefarious troopers, and my personal favorite, robo-mutts. You'll also face off against the budget mercenary group, Goons for Less, who we've seen in previous games, though they used to be called Thugs for Less. Anyhow, the enemies that I find more interesting are the bigger foes that you'll face in some traditional and non-traditional boss encounters. Some of these bosses look to appear in what might be the most epic set pieces Insomniac has ever created. But before we get to that, let's first look at this encounter with a nefarious Juggernaut. This looks to me like a mini-boss fight, and one interesting tidbit here is that this battle actually spans multiple planets after the Juggernaut follows Ratchet through one of the rifts. Another detail to point out here is that once you teleport to this new planet, another enemy joins the battle. And if you look closely, this other enemy is actually dealing damage to the Juggernaut, so when it attacks the Juggernaut, that's not just for show. But this battle pales in comparison to some of the encounters you'll have with some of the game's far more massive foes. Insomniac teased just how big creatures can get in Rift Apart in this brief clip. I sure hope that at some point we get to face off against, or maybe even climb, whatever this thing is. Anyhow, in the most recent preview, we got to meet a hostile giant robot named the Fixer. Not only is the Fixer just absolutely massive, but Rivet and Clank's encounter with the Fixer is a literal roller coaster ride through the cliffs and the caves of Planet Tauren 4. If you ask me, this segment looks heavily inspired by the Matterhorn at Disneyland. Anyhow, from what we've seen, this does not look like a traditional boss fight, and to be honest, based on what I've heard, story-wise, I'm not sure the Fixer is actually a bad guy. I think he's had some sort of malfunction which makes him want to destroy Rivet and Clank, but it's all for the better because it will no doubt result in one of the most astonishing scenes in the entire game. This looks to me like if you combined the scale of enemies in Shadow of the Colossus with the kinetic energy you experience in Insomniac's own Spider-Man games. It just looks awesome. But as cool as some of these enemies might be, the bad guys have never been the main attraction in Ratchet and Clank. Nope, that would be the weapons, gadgets, and gizmos you'll use to take them out. I've already covered some of the gadgets in Rift Apart, starting with the hover boots, which again allow you to add some distance to your jumps, make for softer landings, and zoom around open areas. And while nobody from Insomniac has even hinted at the possibility, it's my hope that the gravity boots make a comeback as well. For the uninitiated, gravity boots allowed Ratchet in past games to literally walk on walls made of a specific magnetic material. Maybe it's the grav boots that enable Ratchet and Rivet to perform the new wall run maneuver? I've also mentioned the rift tether, which enables Ratchet and Rivet to grapple towards and pass through dimensional rifts. One note about the rift tether is that on this info card posted to Insomniac's Facebook page, it seems Rivet's mechanical arm will have its own rift tether built in. This could imply that Rivet begins the game with the rift tether, and that these dimensional rifts have long been a part of her universe by the time Clank gets there. Similar to the rift tether, you'll also have the swing shot. That's the gadget that enables your more traditional grappling maneuver. And that's not to be confused with the hurl shot. Basically, this gadget looks like it will allow you to swing around particular points in the environment, build up momentum, then launch yourself far, far, far away. Now, another gadget Insomniac hasn't confirmed or even mentioned, but that I think could make its return, is the Gelinator. I think it's called the Gelinator. As I mentioned earlier, you'll get to explore a gelatonium plant on Sargasso, and it would seem a little odd if we didn't also get to wield a Gelinator, which again allowed Ratchet in Tools of Destruction to shoot gelatonium into square platforms that he could bounce off to reach new heights. But enough about gadgets, let's talk about your weapons. First off, Ratchet has his trusty wrench and Rivet a hammer for melee combat. Nothing new here. But as for acquiring firearms, Ratchet and Rivet will need to visit Miss Zircon. If you remember, Miss Zircon was a boss in 2016's Ratchet and Clank remake, but in this alternate dimension, she happens to be a member of the Resistance and your arms dealer. Let's look at some of the weapons in her inventory. First up is your burst pistol, a trusty sidearm featuring 2 firing modes thanks to the adaptive triggers on the PlayStation 5's DualSense controller. Pull the trigger down halfway and you'll fire 1 accurately aimed shot at a time. Pull down all the way and you'll blast a rapid-fire stream of shots that deals steady damage at the cost of accuracy. Now, we don't know if every gun will have 2 firing modes, but Insomniac has said that every weapon will somehow take advantage of the DualSense controller. Another that we know for sure will have an alt firing mode is the Enforcer. This is a double-barreled shotgun, but instead of firing traditional rounds, it shoots these electrically charged blasts. Pull the trigger down halfway and you'll fire 1 barrel, pull down all the way and you'll fire both barrels simultaneously. That said, if you fire both at the same time, it will take longer to reload. And notice these 2 lights? Those indicate whether you have 1 or 2 rounds in the chamber. Next up is the Shatter Bomb, which looks like Rift Apart's version of a frag grenade, and as far as I know, Insomniac has not highlighted an alternate firing mode for the Shatter Bomb. A great weapon for defensive-minded players is the Void Repulsor. I'm guessing that if you pull the trigger down halfway, you bring up this bright pink shield, and then when you pull down all the way, you fire it at enemies to deal damage. We also got a glimpse of the Lightning Rod, which fires these electric bolts that stick to enemies. It looks like they build up over time and eventually deliver a debilitating shock that leaves your opponent convulsing and vulnerable. Here we see another new weapon called the Drill Hound. From what I can tell, this is a giant drill bit that explodes on impact, but from this footage, it looks like it can also be aimed at the ground so that it burrows its way to opponents, then bursts out of the ground to deal its damage. Finally, before we get to what will surely be crowd favorites, there's the Negatron Collider, which fires a beam of energy that can penetrate multiple enemies at once. What's cool about the Negatron Collider is that you can charge it up before firing using the adaptive trigger. Pull down halfway to charge the gun, then pull down all the way to let it rip. Okay, now it's time to get wacky. Surely you've seen the Topiary Sprinkler. This is a literal garden sprinkler that blasts some horrifying type of fertilizer that freezes enemies in place by turning them into garden hedges. Based on this footage, it appears that this frozen state is temporary, but nonetheless, freezing enemies in place will open them up to more damaging attacks, if only for a short time. Now, a gun that I'm particularly looking forward to is the Ricochet. From the sound of it, it fires a pinball-like round at your target, and with a well-timed press of the trigger, you can then bounce the pinball off their head time and time and time again. Basically, it sounds like a bit of a minigame, and the better you are at timing the bounces, the more damage you'll do. Still with me? Good, because, well, there's more, starting with Mr. Fungi. From what I can tell, this is very similar to Mr. Zircon from previous games, which launched a wisecracking drone robot that would deal damage to nearby enemies. But Mr. Fungi, instead of a robot, is, well, a mushroom. In any case, it'll fight by your side until I'm guessing either time runs out or an enemy takes him out. Plus, the in-game description of the weapon says Mr. Fungi, quote, attacks enemies and potentially distracts them. This leaves open the question, how might it distract enemies, and does this play into some other gameplay mechanic? Moving on, a fun weapon from the 2016 remake that we know will be in Rift Apart is the Pixelizer, which turns enemies into a mass of old-school pixelized video game graphics before they crumble to their death. We haven't seen the Pixelizer in any Rift Apart footage, but we do know that an early unlock of the Pixelizer is included as a pre-order bonus for the game. Next, in the most recent weapons trailer, we got to see the Black Hole Storm and the Cold Snap. I'm not sure what to make of the Black Hole Storm, but as for the Cold Snap, having projectiles that turn your enemies into giant ice cubes is pretty awesome. Okay, I know we've covered a lot of weapons, but there are two more that we know are returning from previous games. First is the Glove of Doom, which fires out robot drones that chase down nearby enemies, then explode. And finally, the Buzzblades, which fire swarms of blades that then ricochet off not just your enemies, but also nearby walls, dealing repeated damage as they, well, swarm around. And before moving on, here are a few more details about weapons in Rift Apart. First off, remember that when you purchase a gun as either Ratchet or Rivet, it will unlock that weapon for both heroes. And as a weapon levels up for one hero, it will also level up for the other. Next, we know that like in past games, you'll level up guns just by using them, meaning the weapon you use the most will end up becoming the most powerful. Oh, and you may have noticed that little yellow bar beneath your reticle. That's your ammo indicator, so you won't have to draw your eyes away from the action to see how much ammo you have left. And lastly, a quick select option will let you map 4 guns to your D-pad, so you won't have to open the weapon wheel every time you want to make a switch. Okay, now that we've looked at all the otherworldly tech you'll get to wield as either Ratchet or Rivet, let's take a look at the real-life tech that's going to make this one of the most beautiful games you've ever played. As I just mentioned, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is shaping up to be one of the most beautiful video games ever released. As such, it's worth looking at some of the technology that'll be on display, as well as the graphics options available. First of all, thanks to the power of the PS5, the game is able to display far more enemies, NPCs, and just overall activity on your screen at any given time. These are without a doubt going to be some of the fullest and richest environments we've ever seen in a Ratchet game, heck, maybe even in a video game. And then there are the ray-traced reflections, which will make surfaces like Clank's brushed steel body, Ratchet's eyes, and other reflective surfaces look absolutely amazing. One cool detail about this, you know the Pixelizer? Apparently when your enemy breaks apart into hundreds of tiny pixels, each pixel will be individually ray-traced. But according to Insomniac, the detail will be so fine that you'll have to use the game's photo mode to zoom in and see the reflections. Pretty cool. We also know that Ratchet and Rivet will feature upgraded fur effects. Even wind will now have a real-time effect on their fur. Okay, so what about graphics options? According to a Famitsu article published all the way back in August of 2020, Rift Apart will have a performance mode and a graphics mode. The graphics mode will run at 4K at 30 frames per second, while the performance mode will run at 60 frames per second, but at a yet unspecified lower resolution, presumably 1080p. It's also not clear whether the game's more advanced graphical features will be included in both or just the graphics mode. For example, will ray-traced reflections be featured in full in both modes? I don't think Insomniac has said one way or the other, at least not yet. One thing we do know based on that same Famitsu article is that ever since the PS3 days, Insomniac has designed Ratchet and Clank to be played at 30 frames per second. But with this new hardware, it's going to be hard to resist experiencing this world at 60 frames per second. Next, if you want to share the gorgeous graphics or you just like taking pretty pictures, this is the first Ratchet and Clank game to feature a photo mode. After tinkering with the photo mode in Insomniac's Spider-Man Miles Morales, it'll be interesting to see which of those features they include here. The last graphics-related feature I want to talk about, though it encompasses a lot more than just graphics, are the accessibility features. As we saw with The Last of Us Part 2, it seems that Sony's first-party studios are placing a huge emphasis on accessibility, and it's impossible to overstate how cool this is. Thankfully, Ratchet and Clank will feature a ton of options. One worth mentioning is the shader, which lets you change the color of certain on-screen elements like Ratchet, Rivet, enemies, bosses, interactive elements, and collectibles. Or you can adjust the size of on-screen icons. In addition to visual options, some options affect actual gameplay. Take the ledge guard, which prevents you from falling off ledges in the game. Or global time slowdown, which allows players to slow down time in the world so they can get past parts that might be giving them a tough time. Now, these are just a few of many more options. In fact, Insomniac recently revealed a bunch more which were highlighted in a PlayStation blog post that I'll link to in the description. And in case you were wondering, trophies will not be affected by the accessibility features. And there you have it. That's everything I've learned about Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends. And like I said at the outset, only 6% of my viewers are subscribed to my channel, which is mind-blowing. I know we can do better, so if you'd like to get notified the next time I post a preview just like this one, definitely hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you get notifications. Lastly, if you want to keep up with me and see what I'm playing, you can follow me on Twitter at QuestModeGames. Until next time, I want to remind everyone to never stop questing.